This morning, President Obama will lay out a series of executive actions aimed at curbing gun violence in the U.S. But with Americans divided on the issue of gun control, the plan already being met with split opinions. Joining us now to debate it is the president of the Brady Campaign to End Gun Violence, Dan Gross, and the executive director of Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for being here. Dan, let me start with you. How big of a deal is what President Obama is doing today? Because we've heard from other analysts who say he's really just clarifying existing policy.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that all he's doing is clarifying existing policy, yet it is a huge deal. It's historic. It's the biggest thing that's happened on a national level on this issue since the Brady Law was passed in 1994. It passed in 93, implemented in 1994, because it expands those life-saving background checks to people who are doing business in this country every day as gun retailers, but just aren't subject to the same requirements where they need to do those background checks.
Okay, so Larry, it is expanding the so-called restrictions on the gun show loophole and internet sales. There are polls that suggest that 89% of Americans support closing those loopholes. So what's your issue with this?
Well, there's hardly any of the guns that end up in crime that are traced back to gun shows, and that's the federal government's own data. So we're addressing something that doesn't really go after the problem. If the government and if the folks that are clamoring for change in this area really wanted to make a change, rather than going after a loophole that's not really there, they might take a look at where most of the tragedies have occurred with public shootings, mass murders. They've been in gun-free zones, and all but 2 of these horrible episodes have occurred in these gun-free zones since 1950. Congress needs to get busy and get rid of those.
Okay, Dan, would you want to tackle that? Gun-free zones don't appear to be working.
No, that's not what we're here to talk about. I mean, the reality is that gun-free zones has nothing to do with the problem that we have in our country with gun violence. The problem is too many guns wind up in the hands of people who intend on doing harm, people who we all agree shouldn't have guns, convicted felons, domestic abusers, the dangerously mentally ill, and there are things, really effective things that we can do to keep guns out of those hands. The most effective thing is Brady background checks. Brady background checks have blocked 2.4 million sales to those prohibited purchasers, domestic abusers, convicted felons, dangerously mentally ill. Problem is, every single day in our country, there are thousands of gun sales that aren't subject to those Brady background checks. So anybody who is against people who are in the business of selling guns, not doing Brady background checks, has an interest other than the best interest of the safety of the American people. And of course they want to talk about everything, other than background checks, because background checks work. And, these people who aren't representing the safety of the American people, I mean, it's so interesting that Mr. Pratt represents an organization called Gun Owners of America. More than 80% of gun owners support expanding Brady background checks to all gun sales.
Okay.
So, we're not talking about, when we're talking about gun-free zones, the best interest of the American public. We are talking about the best interest of the American public when we're talking about expanding these life-saving, effective Brady background checks.
So, Larry, let's stick with background checks right now, since that is what the president is tackling. What about that impressive figure that 2.2 million prohibited buyers have been blocked from being able to buy firearms because of background checks? Who could disagree with that?
Well, in the last year of record, we had some million-plus background checks done, and for that trouble, there were 14 prosecutions. This is not a crime-fighting tool. Criminals don't get their guns through lawful means. And so the idea that somehow this device is keeping guns out of criminals' hands is to whistle past the graveyard. We need to get rid of the places where these tragedies occur, and you can't just dispense with the subject by saying, oh, well, we're not talking about that now. Well, if we're not, we better be talking about what really is the problem. Otherwise, we're specializing in nothing.
Dan,
the problem...
Dan, I do want you to address that, because this is the argument that we always hear. Criminals don't abide by any of these laws. It doesn't matter if you clarify existing laws or make new laws. Criminals don't abide by them.
Listen, you're never going to keep every gun out of the hand of every criminal. You're not going to prevent every tragedy. But you can prevent a heck of a lot of them by keeping guns out of the hands of the people that we all agree shouldn't have them. And that's what backgrounds do effectively. Don't look at prosecutions. Look at the fact that 2.4 million sales have been blocked. You have to dig really deep to try and come up with some misleading statistic to try and show that background checks don't work, because they do. Every day, hundreds of sales, whether they're prosecuted or not, hundreds of sales are blocked. Those are guns that do not wind up in the hands of people who we all agree shouldn't have them. So again, anybody who argues against background checks really does not have the interest of the American public at heart, does not have our safety at heart, does not have our will at heart. 93% of the American public supports expanding Brady background checks, more than 80% of gun owners, more than 70% of NRA members. This is not a debate among the American public. We know what's right here, and Mr. Pratt really is not representing the interests of the American public with his arguments.
Gentlemen, we have to leave it there. We thank you both for the debate. It'll be interesting to see what the president says today. Also, we have a special programming reminder for you. President Obama will join Anderson Cooper for an exclusive live town hall event on guns in America. It will air this Thursday night, 8 p.m., only here on CNN.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.